The PlayStation 5 has been out for just about a year and a half. Today, I'm going to highlight 5 games that I've enjoyed on PS5 so far. For this list, I'm going to be including games that run natively on PS5. I just finished playing Assassin's Creed 4 on my PS5, but since it's a PS4 game, it was not included in this list. I'm not declaring these to be the 5 best games on the console. This isn't a ranking of these games. These are just games that stuck out to me, presented in release order. My name is James, and I started this channel because I love playing and talking about video games. If that sounds like you, please consider hitting the like button on this video, subscribing to my channel, and checking out some of my other videos as well. Let's get started. First up is the PS5 launch game, Spider-Man Miles Morales. Also available on PS4, Miles Morales is a follow-up to 2018's Spider-Man. This game follows about a week or so of Miles holding it down as Spider-Man while Peter Parker is on vacation. Miles Morales is much shorter than Spider-Man 2018, and around the launch of the game, I remember people saying that the game was much too short. Some were even saying that you can finish it in about 3 hours or so, which is true. If you mainline the entire story and do nothing else, it'll take you roughly 3 hours. However, the side characters, side quests, in the world are very rich and have so much personality that I really can't even imagine playing only the main story and feeling like you're done with the game. I spent a little over 20 hours with the game to get the Platinum Trophy, and I enjoyed my time with it. The story in Miles Morales is okay, but the gameplay is where the game really shines. Insomniac built on the foundation of Spider-Man 2018. Playing through Spider-Man Remastered and Miles Morales back-to-back, I noticed that these games are actually quite different. From the character animations to personalities to even the overall message of the games, Spider-Man Miles Morales does plenty to set itself apart as both a game and to establish Miles as a different Spider-Man than Peter. When swinging, Miles flails around and flips over much more than Peter, and their fighting animations and open combat are also pretty different as well. Miles doesn't use quite as many gadgets as Peter does. He actually only has 4 available in the game, where I believe that in the first game, Peter had 8 or 10 that he was able to use. Miles uses he uses more or different technology. He has an app on his phone, and then he also allows others to help him out more, whereas Peter is constantly telling other people like Mary Jane and Officer Davis not to get involved. I believe that the overall intention of this game was to set up Miles Morales as a character so that we can experience more of both him and Peter in Spider-Man 2, and I think that Insomniac knocked it out of the park. Next up is the Pathless, available on PS5 digitally at launch and physically a little bit later. I bought this game solely because it was a PlayStation exclusive. I really didn't know much about the Pathless before playing. I was unfamiliar with both Annapurna and Giant Squid, the publisher and developer, but I ended up giving it a shot anyway. In the Pathless, you play as the Archer, and you harness nature and befriend wildlife on your quest to cleanse a darkness that is engulfing the entire world. The overarching quest is pretty basic, but the gameplay and art design are what stood out to me in the game. The traversal specifically is one of my favorite parts. You can run with the wildlife, you can use your eagle to glide around the world, and you can bullseye enemies with your bow to gain momentum as you're running and flying and doing all this other stuff. At times, traveling the wide landscapes in the Pathless is so fluid that it almost feels like a rhythm game. The Pathless is also packed with many puzzles and challenges, which I love as well. The puzzles are mostly pretty simple, but with some more difficult ones scattered in the mix. You progress through the story by solving puzzles to gain relics that are then used to cleanse an area of darkness. Other puzzles are used to earn experience towards upgrades or gain access to pieces of lore. And as someone who enjoys both fluid traversal and puzzles, this was the perfect game for me. Next up is Immortals Fenyx Rising. This one was not a launch game, but it was there that first week in December. I believe it came out December 3rd of 2020. Immortals is a brand new IP from Ubisoft. Originally, the game was introduced at E3 as Gods and Monsters, but rumor has it that they faced copyright issues with Monster Energy. I love Greek mythology, and I was always excited and looking forward to this game, so I'm glad that copyright stuff didn't prevent it from coming out. I do remember during the lead up to this game and right around launch, the narrative surrounding this game was that it's Ubisoft's Breath of the Wild, and I understand how someone can make that conclusion. Both games feature a large open world with cartoonish art styles. Both games feature climbing and gliding as your primary ways to get around, and both feature many, many, many challenges. The difference in these games is where Immortals stands out to me. I had a lot of fun with the story in Immortals, even if it was a little bit basic. The entire game has a comedic tone, which I found to be rather refreshing since so many games try to be dark and gritty or hyper-realistic. The story isn't very impressive. It's basically restore power to these areas so that you can team up to defeat the final boss, which really isn't anything new. It's actually the exact same story that I mentioned in the Pathless, which I talked about 2 minutes ago. It's also the same story as Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which we already talked about how people said that this game was just Ubisoft's Breath of the Wild, and it's also the same story, pretty similar story to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is actually another Ubisoft game, which, if I want to say actually came out a month before this game, if I remember correctly. All of that being said, in the individual areas of the game that you visit, the characters in Greek mythology really stand out. I mentioned that I enjoyed the comedic and godlike nature of the game, and I think that is one of the game's biggest strengths. On the surface, Immortals Fenyx Rising looks like they're just trying to make it marketable to children so that it sells better in the long run, but this lighter structure allows them to create adventures and stories that wouldn't be possible in dark and gritty, hyper-realistic games, which have become so common. In this game, for example, one of the characters that you meet is Ares, the god of war, except he's been turned into a chicken, and you have to help him get turned back into a god. And a story like that, or really anything like that, wouldn't make sense in a game like The Last of Us if, halfway through the game, Joel is like, hey, Ellie, hold on for a second. I know you just watched me kill like 30 people, but we got to go help this guy over here who's been turned into a chicken. We got to turn him back into a man before we continue what we were doing. The last thing I wanted to talk about for Immortals Fenyx Rising is the combat. I was captivated by the combat in this game. You have lots of options of special abilities and upgrades that really allow you to play the game however you want. When I started the game, I was all about melee combat and brute force, but later on in the game, you find different items and abilities and weapons, and I had a really fun time kind of stacking those abilities, and I made a kind of like an archer bow build that I really enjoyed. It felt like I had just mastered the game. I had a lot of fun with Immortals Fenyx Rising. I'd highly recommend checking it out if it sounds like something you might enjoy. Next up is Returnal. Returnal came out in April of 2021 as one of the first actual PS5 exclusives. It's a third-person shooter roguelike, and depending on how you play it, it can also sometimes feel like a platformer, too, if you play it like I do. Around launch, some users were experiencing weird crashes, and a plethora of strange arguments surrounded the entire game. The same game difficulty debate came back for a little while. People were upset that you couldn't save during a run, and they were making these outlandish claims that a single run can take like 8 to 10 hours. I saw a guy on Reddit upset because he wanted a third-person shooter and didn't know it was a roguelike until after he bought the game, which, if you ask me, that's kind of his problem, because, you should probably do some research about the games you're thinking about buying by probably watching videos like this one. Anyway, most notably, many people were having frequent crashes and couldn't even play the game, and Sony pretty much refused all refund requests. I was in the frequent crash group. I couldn't play the game for more than about 15 or 20 minutes without crashing, which sucked. I ended up sending my console to Sony, and they sent it back. The problems continued. I ended up getting a new PS5, and then after getting the new PS5, I played around 65 hours of Returnal and didn't experience a single crash. I wanted to put all that on the table first. Everything else that I say after this point is going to be based on that 65 hours of Returnal that I played after replacing my console. Returnal is easily my favorite game on PS5. Nothing else even comes close. The criticism that I mentioned earlier didn't resonate with me at all, except for the crashes, which I already went into a little bit. One of my favorite things about this game is the story, or lack of story. For much of the game, you're left to kind of interpret what's going on in your own way, and I think that my fondness of this game comes from my interpretation of the story. It's clear from flashbacks and cutscenes that Celine has faced both physical and emotional trauma in her life, and I personally like the interpretation that Atropos is a metaphor for her depression, the same depression that she would have experienced on Earth as a result of her traumatic events goes with her to Atropos. And surviving Atropos, the planet that you're on in Returnal, can feel endless and meaningless, like you're just doing the same thing over and over again and never making any progress and never growing, and living with depression can feel the same way. I also think that most of the criticisms that I mentioned earlier in the video actually strengthen this interpretation as well. Like, oh, you think the game is too difficult? Well, like, that's the point. Like, living with depression is difficult. Like, you want to go back, you want to like save your progress and like come back later. Like, let me put down this depression for a little bit and come back when I'm ready for it. Let me just like pick it back up. That would be convenient, wouldn't it? Through that lens, these criticisms don't really make much sense. The depression metaphor really resonated with me, but just like most of the games on this list, gameplay reigns supreme. The fluidity of moving and shooting and dodging is unlike any other shooter that I've played. Movement is so important that at times it almost feels like a platformer rather than a shooter. Also, I loved mastering the RNG, and feeling like you're using the game to defeat the game is something that I can't even put into words. The last game that I'm going to talk about is Deathloop. Deathloop is an interesting one because it was created by Arcane Studios and published by Bethesda, and it was already under contract to be a timed PS5 exclusive when Microsoft bought Bethesda, which I believe happened in 2020. I remember that leading up to Deathloop, Sony was showing it off so much to the point that we got tired of seeing it. I also remember being confused as to why another PS5 exclusive, one of the very few PS5 exclusives, was another roguelike. For that reason, I waited until later to pick up Deathloop, and I actually didn't end up playing it until January of this year. In Deathloop, you play as Colt, and you're stuck in a time loop, and you learn that you need to kill 6 specific targets in order to break the loop and return home. I found Deathloop to be fun, but there was one big disappointment in there for me, which we'll get out of the way first. The marketing for the game made it seem like you have lots of control over the events of the game as the player. I went into the game thinking that you had to figure out how and when to kill each target, the best order and best location for each one. In reality, you do find all of that out, but there's really only one possible solution, and the game pretty much tells you exactly what it is if you just follow the objectives that the game sets for you. I still enjoyed going through the stories and seeing how different choices affected the target schedules, and the alterations to the character behavior based on in-game events helps add some personality to all of the different characters. I also liked that once you knew where and when to kill each target, you can still, for the most part, take them out however you please. Sometimes it's better to run in there with a big gun, and sometimes it's better to use stealth, but the game kind of lets you figure that out on your own. Last, I like that in the planning process, you can follow the leads and on the different targets in pretty much any order. And I didn't find the game particularly difficult, but every once in a while I'd get a little bit stuck, and it was nice that you could just start doing research on a different target for a little bit, and then come back to your previous target when you were ready. If you're unsure about Deathloop, honestly, I'd probably just go ahead and get it. It's going on Amazon right now for about $25, which I think is a great price. Thank you so much for watching this video. In the comment section, make sure to let me know what your favorite PS5 games have been so far, and don't forget to check out my Let's Plays, which get new episodes every Monday and Wednesday. As always, the best place to keep up with me is on Twitter at James_Solar. Until next time, thanks for watching.